Hi, and welcome to another PSCA Coronavirus Roundtable. Today, we really want to focus on school climate and school culture. And so we had a chance to have two great experts, Dr. Whitney Allgood and Dr. Stacie Molnar-Main. Could you both please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Whitney Allgood. I'm the CEO of the National School Climate Center at Ramapo for Children. The National School Climate Center has been serving schools and communities since 1996 through the use of research-based surveys and coaching support to diagnose challenges and strengthen school climates so that students, families, and staff can reach their individual and shared potential. I'm a lifelong advocate of equal access to high quality learning and learning environments for all students. And when I say equal, I include in that equitable, so that we adjust our learning environments, our strategies, and our practices and our behaviors and values every single day so that everybody has the opportunity that they need to connect, engage, and thrive in our schools. I've been doing this for a long time. I don't know if you want me to run down any of that stuff, but I've been doing this work in a number of different roles over the last few years. I've been the National Director of Teen Programs for Step Up. We offered SEL-based free after-school programming to young women. I've worked for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, the district DC Office of Accountability and Assessment as well. And I've been a teacher, both in public schools and in alternative settings, foster homes, group homes, juvenile detention, diagnostic and evaluation centers, homeschools, things like that. So that's where I got my start. Awesome. Thanks for having me.
And Stacie, thank you for coming.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacie Molnar-Main. I am an educational consultant. My areas of expertise are social emotional learning, school climate, and civic learning. I'm the consultant for the Pennsylvania Department of Education on school climate efforts and work to coordinate a statewide network that focuses on providing technical assistance to schools on issues of school climate. And we've collaborated with Whitney and the folks at the National School Climate Center over the last few years to get a system up and running. My background is as a school psychologist and educational leader. I've worked in youth civic engagement efforts. I've worked in civic education research and practice, leading statewide bullying prevention efforts and evaluating violence prevention and school climate efforts. While I have a lot of expertise, I know that our school counselors and others have a great deal of expertise as well. And my only regret is that this is a recorded session and we don't get to hear from them. But hopefully Whitney and I can have a generative conversation and help folks out in the field begin to think about the things that they're already doing that they can build on to strengthen school climate, and ways that they might innovate and do things differently, as well as maybe some blind spots that they weren't aware of that they can think of right now as we're approaching sort of an unprecedented moment in thinking about this issue.
Again, thank you both for just making yourselves available. I really appreciate it. Why don't we just jump into it right now? I mean, just getting to the heart of the matter, what are your biggest concerns when it comes to the school closures and overall the impact of COVID as far as our students, our schools, and communities?
Well, the biggest impact I think right now is social disconnection, disruption to everyday routines and comforts, and the psychological and emotional effects of extended periods of uncertainty and fear. Everyone is reeling with a new reality at the same time that they're trying to rapidly learn new skills and ways of schooling and working at the same time that their most basic and fundamental supports and routines and sources of comfort are gone. That's, you know, a lot of hits. How do we work? What should work look like? How much work is enough work in each day? This is a trauma, and all of the things that we know about how trauma affects peoples and communities are in play right now. So I think that we have to, that's my big, I think it's the biggest impact, is helping people get through this trauma with as little damage as possible, and keeping them connected and trusting in their schools so that they will re-engage when the time comes, and we can move from there in the best possible way.
I think that Whitney really nailed it. I would only add that we have the challenge of thinking about how we support educators and families at this time in a unique way. So while the focus tends to be on how do we carry out our educational mission, I think the spotlight also needs to be placed on how are we helping our educators deal with this trauma, this disruption, the strains that they have in their own personal lives, and then learning a whole new system or approach to their work. So I think that that's really critical, as well as recognizing that our families are now in an educational role in many places because the kids are learning at home. And it really calls on us, it's an opportunity, in fact, to think about how we might work with families differently and in a supportive role.
Yeah, I've really come to appreciate my new role, not only as a school counselor, but as an elementary school teacher, principal, and custodian. These recent spills have been a little alarming, though.
Yeah.
But I mean, it really is the palpable conversation as far as the shift where our focus, our new educational mission during these times is meaningful connectedness, and that's a different challenge. That so I hear some of the conversation as far as the impact. What are some of those other ripple effects that you're seeing or hearing from the field right
Well, I think we can just, I think, unpack some of those. I mean, underline all of them. And first of all, I would say that when we at the National School Climate Center speak, we frequently use the phrase school community, and I think we could do a better job of being explicit about that. We aren't ever just talking about students. We're always talking about everybody in the school community and how they are experiencing school. So the idea of being that the staff, the teachers, the caregivers, and even other agencies, and the way that they understand the school climate, trust the school, feel supported by, or like they have access to offer support to. So we're always trying to take that's always included in there. I think that what we're seeing in terms of the ripple effects are that, you know, there's the strain that we know that everybody is under. Like a lot of what we just talked about is what everybody is experiencing. But then we also know for a fact that some families are experiencing this more in more challenging ways, more traumatic way. So we've got situations where people can't get connected, where the schools are like, well, I can't get connected to the students, and that can be because there's not the sufficient technology to get to the students, but it can also be because sometimes schools and districts have made rules about the types of connectivity that is allowed, and a whole suite of resources and tools that school folks thought they had at their disposal, and they're getting all this advice about ways to engage kids online. And so one of the things that we got last week was, when we talked with people in the field, was we're not allowed to do that. We can't do TikTok. We can't do Flip. We can't get people to get online or connect or to download the Google Docs even. So for them, there's this whole group of people out there that's like, okay, everything you're telling me to do, I'm trying to do, and it's not happening. So not only is this leading to further disconnection, and for everyone, it's also that too is traumatizing. I want to speak again to what Stacie was saying about staff and be very specific about this, is that many school personnel are suffering greatly right now because they cannot get connected to their students, and they're worried about them. And that is a secondary trauma that they're carrying as well. So I think there's also the pressure that is coming in from some communities on schools to continue learning at the same pace, to provide a lot of resources that not only can they not, but they know as educators it's not the right thing to do right now as well. Or there are other reasons systemically for not wanting to do that that have to do with widening gaps and inequities and things like that. So there's all kinds of, those are just a small sampling of the smaller types of pressures and things that are within this larger traumatic experience for people.
Yeah, I would add simply and echo what Whitney said, and just simply add that, you know, when you have this degree of uncertainty in a crisis situation, and it's for an extended period of time, you have extended exposure to stress and the effects of that. You have opportunities for a lot of misunderstandings to occur for a variety of reasons, because people are under stress, because maybe what was communicated wasn't communicated in a way that someone could receive it, or you know, there's barriers to communication. And then there's the loss that we are all experiencing from the loss of you know, our day-to-day routines, to young people who are losing things that they've been looking forward to for their, you know, their whole lives. The seniors I think of, but other students who maybe worked hard for an achievement that won't be recognized. They're losing out on a sports season. Maybe a parent has lost a job and they've lost a way of life. So I think the fallout is across the board in many different places. And if we could think about, as we attend to school climate improvement, which we need to still do in this new context, we need to be thinking about what do people need when they're under stress? What do people need when there is misunderstanding? There's a chance for misunderstandings to occur, and how do we deal with loss? So it's like a very complex set of outcomes and possible issues, but if we can begin to start to break them down, and our school counselors have expertise in each of these areas. And I think it's important to think about the skill sets our counselors bring to the table as it relates to stress, communication, and loss, and how can we begin to utilize our skill set as consultants and as members of these communities to help in those areas.
You know, you've covered a lot of ground. I mean, like first, I think I heard Whitney introduce that we might be doing a TikTok video at the end of this, and we'll address everything. But in addition to that, I mean, just if we could dial it back, just to make it clear, to make sure, as we expand on your expertise, just a foundational conversation for any of our listeners with the range of experiences we bring in. How does fostering school climate and culture help to support people through trauma and help to bridge gaps in inequity?
I can start on that because I know that Whitney can really expand on that with the national experience that they have at the National School Climate Center. From a Pennsylvania standpoint, when we talk about school climate, we have conceptualized school climate in 3 ways. And in each of these domains that we talk about are related to recovery and trauma. Okay, it wasn't built that way, but that's what supportive systems look like. They also help build resilience, right? So when we think about school climate in Pennsylvania, we think about safety. How do our schools or educational settings help students to feel safe emotionally, physically, behaviorally, across the board? And so, so that's one category. Another category is support. How do our school systems or our educational environments, whether they be online or face-to-face, help students feel socially supported, behaviorally supported, and have their learning supported? And then we talk about social emotional learning as the third component. And this really relates to the skills that students develop to be able to interact successfully in whatever situations they're presented with, have self-awareness, have relationship skills so that they can build those solid relationships that help them work through challenging times and make decisions in their lives. So those 3 areas, safety, support, and social emotional learning, are also quite relevant to adapting to stress dealing with crisis, and then recovering over time. So when we think about this work in Pennsylvania, translating it to an online environment, we really want to encourage folks to think about strategies in those 3 areas.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that school climate, first of all, we're going to talk about equity, but I want to begin by saying that everything that Stacie just said too it's what's really important here that I don't know that we highlight enough is that all of those things are precursors to learning. Everything that she just said is a precursor to learning. It's a precursor to collegiality and working effectively as a team. So it's about the staff as well. We know that the outcomes of students and staff rise and fall with the health of the climate and the extent to which people feel safe and feel supported and that they can supported to take risks and try new things. Those are all important things. And so I think that what's important too to recognize is that some people might think, well, we have so much on our plate right now, we can't talk about school climate. If you were not focusing on school climate prior to this is the perfect time to start thinking about because in fact you are thinking about school climate, because climate is happening whether schools are in session or not. The community can feel like a safe space or not. It can feel like a supporting space or not. It can feel like a place where you're getting the skills to cope with challenges or not in the SEL competencies. Whether we're in session,
whether it's going to happen, whether we bring an umbrella or not.
Right. So if you are a school or in a system where this has not been a priority, but you're following all of the advice out there about what you should be attending to at the moment, which is those things, then guess what? You're attending to school climate. So the thing about equity is, school climate it's about how people experience school, how the patterns, rules, norms, and values create a total experience for people. And schools and school systems should be aware of and intentional about school climate because, as I said earlier, everybody performs better in healthier settings. And when our schools do better, then our society does better. The thing is that the people who are most likely to have a negative experience of school climate are not randomly occurring. They're patterns. The people most likely to feel disconnected and disengaged, to not feel supported or like they have relationships with people who know them and who they can trust to both support them and help them achieve. Groups whose lives, needs, fears, ambitions, values, and stories aren't reflected in our institutions and systems, the very systems and institutions that are supposed to be helping them thrive. They're members of groups that have been pushed to the margins for economic, racist, religious, classist, sexist, or other reasons. And these minority groups are no longer a minority. The majority of Americans fall into one or more of these groups. So we can't say we have a healthy school climate for students and staff who are comfortable here. School climate requires us to ask who is not experiencing this school the way we want and need them to experience it, and how can we change that? It pulls back the curtains on the subgroups of how different pockets of people are experiencing school, and also on other lagging indicators that we know are associated with groups, such as, and within equity, such as attendance, disciplinary referrals, special education referrals, graduation rates, teacher turnover. And it allows school and system leaders to get to the root cause of these lagging indicators and begin problem solving and developing action strategies around those things. So it is, we're always having this conversation at the National School Climate Center about where do we talk about equity. And I'm always saying, if we're doing this work the way we're supposed to be, if we're doing it really, then we are talking about equity. It is an act of seeking to create a more equitable environment and outcomes.
Absolutely, Whitney. And I think that's why, because we want to be able to shine a light on how different groups are experiencing the school climate, we need to be thinking about what data exists so that we can have conversations about this, right? And you know, in Pennsylvania, we know that schools have been dealing with the digital divide for a long time, but now that we're in a COVID situation, this has really become apparent. The impact that inequities in access have created for students. And so there's data for us that we need to be acting on, but we need to also be thinking about how that impacts students' feeling of safety in a learning environment, how it impacts their feelings of support, et cetera, and how we can innovate to maintain and build relationships, build resiliency in kids, and bridge those access divides right now. We can't put it off because it really, it right now means it's very clear that some students have access and others don't. So we need to look to data. We need to be thinking ahead about as we move into next year, how are we going to collect data on climate so that we can begin to make sure that we are paying attention to equity issues because our school climate and our ability to achieve for all children is only as good as our ability to provide a safe and supportive climate for the students that may be the most challenging to reach and for the students who we may feel like we have not served best in the past or that our data has shined the light on.
I mean, clearly there's a clear historical narrative and clear data sets point to the students who have been systemically disadvantaged by our education systems. But with that being said, traditional data sets, including school discipline, exclusionary practices, and attendance, are probably going to look not a lot different. I mean, we're still going to have up through March, but they're going to look different. What are some of those other emerging data sets that might be good as far as understanding the school climate and culture, just in your opinion, as you were talking about it?
Well, I think that we know in many of our communities, we've had data on our free and reduced lunch access. Now we have more and more families that are in need of that type of support as unemployment has increased. So those are data sets that we need to figure out how we look at and how do we come together across organizations that serve children and families to understand the degree of need in our community and how we reach these families. I think that we are still looking at not just whether a student has a computer, but the amount of engagement that's happening between teachers and students online. And remembering that online connections are not the only ways that we can connect. What are some more personal ways that we might, through using phone technologies and other technologies to engage with students. But I think that we need to be looking even at, as we move into fall, if we still are in a distanced situation, we are also going to need to be taking a pulse of how students are perceiving safety, how they're perceiving the support that the school's offering, and how they're exercising their social emotional learning skills. And that's typically some type of surveys.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was just asking a question.
Well,
I really more interested in what you have to say.
Oh, well, I mean, I think looking forward at the data for next year is one thing, but I also think, you know, there's data that we need to collect right now, and there are ways to collect data. And I think that, it's going to require some invention and creativity on our part. And I also think we need to be careful about what we decide to collect data on too, because it might not, you know, it might reinforce the wrong thing. So for example, I guess the way that I've been thinking about it, and I really think that this is a place where social workers and case managers could be very helpful, is touch points. So in other words, are we, you know, for every student, if we've got some type of a log of touch points, and that can be one, whether or not they get online. It can also be whether or not they pick up and return the packets at the school, whether or not they are accessing the lunch that's being provided. So I think thinking about, first of all, what are all of the ways that we're trying to touch our students and families right now? and then this is where I think coordinating is important. Okay, what are ways that other agencies might be touching these families that we need to know about as well? Who do we need to get there? And how can we begin collecting that information and using that to triage? And this again goes to equity, because equity really is about prioritizing. Just as our medical personnel are having to do triage right now, we need to be prepared for that triage. And we need to try to deal with it right now, but also be prepared when schools resume, or in the next few months, and what that's going to look like. There's the number of touches that we are getting from students and families right now is going to be a very big indicator of where we need to focus our services and supports. And I think that, again, this can be, some teachers are driving by homes and doing waves in the morning. And if a student doesn't step out and do the wave to them, then, there's a phone call. There's literal phone calls. There's phone trees. A teacher can't maybe do all the phone calls herself, but back in the day when I was a homeroom mom, we had phone trees, and the teacher called the parent, who called the next parent, who called before there was email. Those might be things that we need to think about. How did we do this before we had everything online? How did we touch, and how did we track these contacts? And so I think that a concerted effort right now around just this basic idea of how many times are we touching, or are they reaching out and touching us, and how can we use that information to get ourselves informed and ready to meet the needs that are the greatest.
Whitney, was it you that we were talking last week about, was it the Phoenix area school district, and how they assigned every student to every adult to have essentially that hyper advisory of everyone having a touch point from one adult in the building?
No, it wasn't us, but that's a great idea. That's exactly, those are the kinds of, yeah. I think and this is really where, when we keep hearing it over again, what are priorities? It's connection, engagement, well-being, connection, engagement, and well-being. And those things, as with everything in education, they can begin to be kind of empty and not mean anything. But it really is, I think, the guide here for so much. So, okay, if connection is the most important thing, then how do we know we are or are not doing that? What are the different ways that could look like in this new environment? And so I think that's kind of, like I said, it's question number one, because everything flows from that. If they're not connected, they're not engaged, and their well-being is a question mark, but we can assume in many cases that it's not good, right? So that's number one.
We might have to stop this because you guys are on fire right now. So let's just jump into it. You've been throwing out some strategies and recommendations, but really, what are some practical strategies or recommendations that you would have for school counselors and other educators, either now during school closures or as schools resume, to help to build and foster or maintain school climate and culture?
So I'll hop in here now because one of my former roles was as a school psychologist and counselor. I was in a dual role. And I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of, and we need to really be thinking about how we partner across the student support services to offer support to students. There are going to be many, many children that need individual contacts, right? And so we will be drawn into the role of providing those tier 2, tier 3 contacts, because when we talk about triage in Pennsylvania, we're talking about MTSS, right? However, our counselors should not lose sight of their role as consultant in a consultancy role to help to guide those universal level strategies that the school will put into place in terms of promoting routines, relationship building activities, touch points that are at the universal level for kids, addressing issues of SEL, addressing issues of support at the universal level, and helping our teachers negotiate their new roles. I think that it can't be, we can't understate the need for the counselor's voice in helping to make sure that climate and universal student supports, universal relationships are built into the continuity of education plans. because there's plenty of people in the systems who will be thinking about the educational pieces that need to go into place, the emergency management pieces that might need to go into place in terms of health and safety. But our counselors are uniquely positioned, and they're often one of the only ones in a building who can raise the importance of student mental health strategies at the universal level, and school climate. So we do have a list that I can read from in terms of the types of strategies that PDE is recommending, but we also have a resource online that folks can access, and that might be the easiest way to address that, as well as a number of resources that counselors might help to disseminate and use in their consultancy role.
Is there a, in addition to linking back to the state's website, if we could post it on our website in addition to this video, which we'll be sharing?
Yes, I think we should be able to get you a 1 or 2 pager that I think at this point it's 2 pages that you could post.
Sounds good. Virtual high five. Thank you. What are some other strategies or tools that we could highlight at this point to really help during the school closures, or and when we talk about re-engaging students on the other side?
I think one of the tensions, well, I want to just second everything that Stacie just said about school counselors. I think this is really an important time to leverage that expertise and experience in that particular lens. It's always important, but there are methods of engagement and of knowing that counselors bring that people that have been trained as educators desperately need right now and can benefit. The whole system needs that lens. And so I think that's really important. And I know we're going to talk at some point about implications for the future. And I think that one big implication for next year is looking at ratios of counselors, psychologists, social workers, nurses to students, and that that we're another year or so off easily from being able to slow down on our prioritization of well-being first. And not that we would ever want to do that, but obviously we're in a very intensive moment right now. I think that one of the tensions, and I know that I'm experiencing this every day in my own work as a leader of a team, is that we want to be sensitive to the pressures and constraints that everybody is under. And so we might be afraid to create rules or norms or values or standard practices. And that's not a good idea right now. We actually do need to say, there are rules and that we need, that students need, staff need, expectations. How we carry out on what those look like might be different. But if, for example, we might not have had to have a rule before around how to connect or log your connection to students each day beyond, attendance. Now there might need to be. I have spoken with teachers that have said, some of us are working really hard to make these connections with families. Some people are just tuning in, and if the students are there, they're there, and if they're not there. So I think a school-wide expectation about what that means, check-in points, routines are all very important. Just the same way we need those we're talking about for students. We had rules about what harassing behavior looked like at school. We're going to have to talk about what does harassing behavior look like virtually or remotely, and what are the consequences. So I think that there are a lot of areas that I can understand in the hurry in the crisis stage immediately following this, that we didn't look at. But if not, it's time now to say, okay, what are the rules and norms and routines that we need to support our values and the things that matter to us and the things that we say are our priorities, and spend some time on that. So that's one best practice I want to highlight. And I think also among school leaders and system leaders is this thought of thinking about the future. This can be all consuming, but disciplining ourselves to put 10 or 15% of that time and energy that we're talking about how do we meet needs right now into what do we need to look like moving forward in order to deal with the long-term effects of that is really important as well.
Yeah. We've been in a lot of different both building and district level conversations, and just kind of talking about the end of school closures being somewhere between the end of prohibition to being something that really is going to be a deep communal grief or mourning, and we're trying to navigate some of those things right now. When it comes to kind of building that new community, building that new climate, what are some thoughts that you would have, Whitney?
The new right now, or you mean when we get back together?
Why don't we start with right now?
Yeah. Well, I think that we've talked about, we've talked about advisories already. And I do think, again, this is one of those places we need to look at and say, if we're going to prioritize connection, engagement, and well-being, then what percentage of our school day goes toward those things, and what does that look like? And how do we might have, maybe pool our resources, or if we can't expect students to be online or teachers to be online 6-7 hours a day, then how do we do what we need to do in 4 hours, and then then work together as new teams around also making sure that a portion of that time is devoted to advisories, morning circles, check-ins, whatever explicitly putting out there, this is a value. I also think another is practicing the techniques that we know are associated with wellness. There are, all kinds of curricula out there around mindfulness and meditation, and stress management. But learning all of those things can also be stressful, especially for staff that haven't had to do it. So again, one tip is kind of goes back to finding, doing, a little mapping of your school. Who does have these skill sets, and how can we change the workday or the way that we're doing things to make sure that the people with those skill sets get to the students, get to everybody. But I think the other thing that I'm really encouraging people is, this is one thing that I learned. I talked earlier about my early experiences in kind of one-room schoolhouses and group homes and emergency shelters. And one thing I learned early on as a young teacher there, I had students that were in first grade, and I had students that were seniors in these schoolhouses, and there was no way I could teach every subject at all grade level. And I learned that the best way to deal with that was when they came to me to say, I don't really know, together. And that can be a great mantra that all of us are saying to young people right now. And I want to just, turn that specifically to, mindfulness, meditation, and coping strategies. As an educator, if you don't know those things, but it's important, and that you should be spending a portion of your time each day on that, then you can just say that. You can say, this is new to me too, so we're going to try this breathing technique today, or we're going to try this temperature check thing I read about last night today. Don't try to put on that you are an expert and that you've mastered it, or make it overly complicated. I think the most important thing is to say is, I care about your well-being. I care about this community's well-being. We're going to try these things that are new, and we're going to figure it out together.
I like the balance of both the vulnerability piece and also the authentic engagement. I mean, those I feel like are some of the most powerful education tools. Stacie, what are some other strategies you feel like that could help foster like school community, school climate now?
Right. Well, I think that we need to be, I missed some of what Whitney said because I lost my connection for a bit. And so let me know if she did mention this. Two things that I think are important is that we need to begin to think about how we think about ourselves as a community, and figure out how we continue to maintain some sense of the routines and rituals of school that may seem familiar. And whether that be that you had, how you did dances before, how do you bring kids together for the purposes of fun now? We need to be thinking about how we deal with those milestone events, because I think that students are experiencing loss. One way to deal with that is to give them some type of replacement activity or experience for that loss while acknowledging the loss. I think we need to be very clear that the issue of COVID is inspiring some xenophobia in our nation. And I think our teachers and educators need to be prepared to be proactive about that and not reactive. Because right now we're all going through a collective trauma. It's always best practice to sort of set norms and standards around how we care about each other and around harassment, racism, et cetera, up front, that it won't, and give folks an opportunity to know where we stand rather than having to come around the back end and deal with that. And so there are some great resources out there on COVID-based bias. I'm going to just share a few I pulled off that I think are particularly good. There's one from Teaching Tolerance about how to respond to COVID-based violence. The National Association of School Psychologists has 14 strategies for teachers and counselors to consider in addressing COVID stigma and racism. The New York Times has a video and lesson plan called Fight Club, how coronavirus infected my high school, and it has a discussion guide that goes with that. There is are a number of other resources that I hope to be able to get to you, Stephen, to post along with our school climate resources. But I'd say that it's really important to deal with the fact that folks are calling this the Chinese virus, and that the flip remarks that students may make, we need to curtail those upfront by having a proactive conversation. And there are some really great discussion guides for teachers that aren't too tough, that give them a real map for talking this through up front. And I would encourage, as we consider our touch points, for us to consider how are we making sure that every kid has a touch point on this particular conversation, so that everyone can feel safe.
That's awesome.
Yeah, very important. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. We need to be totally proactive. This is something we're going to focus on in our safety communications that are coming out, and also in the webinar, but not waiting for this to happen, talking about it right now. And also there, the teaching tolerance and facing history in ourselves are two organizations that have been dealing with these things for decades. They have great curriculum, great resources that teachers and others can access to help deal with the xenophobia. Also, just the knowledge for young, it helps for young people to know too. This is not atypical. This happens every time. This happens every time there's a crisis. These things happen in our society, or in societies in general. So some historical perspective on that. I think historical perspective is really important, because one of the things we know, the way that trauma works on the brain, is that, we feel like isolated, and this is only happening now, and this is a special situation, and we're not going to get through it. And the fact is, it is unique. And I mean, every time I'm hearing this, there's a part of me that's like, oh, stop saying how this is unprecedented. It is, but there's a lot that we can learn from about how to successfully cope and move through this. And we also know the wrong ways that it has been done in the past. We have the tools that we need to avoid falling into those very dangerous patterns that we are beginning to see rear their ugly heads right now.
Yes, and your comment, Whitney, reminds me, as you said, this is unprecedented, and yet we've been here before. I really do want to encourage the school counselors and anyone who's listening to really, we're using our crisis plan, our emergency management plans right now. We're rebuilding them as we go. because some of the things we may not have anticipated in our plan. But as we get through this year and then approach next year, we're still going to be dealing with response and recovery. It's not going to be that we can start the year up and things are going to be like they used to be. We're going to need to be planning for how we're dealing from an emergency management standpoint with our mitigation strategies, as well as our response strategies, and in some cases, recovery. And it's all going to we're going to move back and forth between those different phases. And so those teams are going to be really important in making sure that you have mental health expertise on those teams, and folks with expertise in school climate is really important.
Yeah. I mean, as much as there's a palpable difference between a crisis and a protracted crisis, the reality is that there's still crises nonetheless. As we're talking about with our eyes towards the future at this point, I guess the question is, what reasonable forecasting or recommendations will you make when it comes to after school closures, as far as those next steps when it comes to mitigation, recovery, building new school climate? What are some thoughts that you have as far as we look towards the future and schools have some time as things start to stabilize a little bit to start doing some active planning towards that? What recommendations will you have?
From a Pennsylvania standpoint, the Department of Ed is working on some communications and tools to support schools with this specific issue. So I don't want to get ahead of myself or out of my lane by forecasting what will be in those tools, because they're under development. But what I would say is that we know that as we approach the fall, that the issue of school attendance is going to be a challenge, right? Even if our schools reopen in face-to-face formats, there are going to be people who are reasonably wanting to keep their children home to keep their health, for their health and safety. And so what we are learning in terms of online schooling, thinking about blended models and the like, will be really important, as will making sure that we are communicating proactively and not reactively. I think approach their communication in different ways. Some were very communicative, and that is usually, if you can provide people access to good information, regular communication is better than leaving people weeks and months without information. So as we move forward, making sure we have good systems of communication in place, and that we're communicating regularly and giving folks as much information as we can. But the tools themselves will be released, I hope, over the next month or so. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but Whitney, I know you probably have a nice global perspective that you would bring to it.
Yeah, I think that the bottom line is that what we're going to be dealing with is, now this part is going to be new, right? I mean, in terms of the way that human beings and groups tend to react to crises like this, we know that. But what we don't know is how the institution of schooling in particular is going to be exactly affected, but we know it's going to be, right? We know that being light on our feet is going to be important, maybe some tight, loose structures here, a lot of if, then, and contingency planning. I think that the approach needs to be very formative. I think we can take ideas of summing things up and and put those on the back burner for a little while. It's going to be about diagnosing where people are and mapping out plans from there. And I'm talking about learning and everything, right? And so I think, the assumptions that we can make are that we are going to need a higher proportion of people with a certain skill around being, certain types of and connecting with students and families that I think nurses, school counselors, mental health workers bring. I think to talk about what Stacie just said, one of the things that I've encountered in the past and being involved with schools where, a major traumatic event happened, a student death, a suicide, or things like that. that is on the outside as a support personnel, a lot of times you would find, oh, there's these recommended plans, right? You know, do you know what to do when a student threatens suicide or when a student threatens, and who to contact and who that person's supposed to contact and who reaches out to who. And most schools didn't have that. When we would call the schools we partnered with and say, we're partnering with you in this after school program, you know, these are things that happen. We would like to know what your plan is so that we know who to contact. And they would say, oh, we don't have those. This is definitely something that needs to be done. You know, the American School Psychologists, American Association of School Psychologists and School Counselors, they all have guidelines out there about this. And this is definitely a time to pull those guidelines down and say, do we have these plans and how do we update them? Because this is a huge part of people's feeling of trust and feeling supported in a school is when something goes wrong, do I know what to do and who to talk to next? You know, what are the, do people care enough about me and about us that they've given some thought to that and communicated it? The same way that in a room, we physically have in a case of a fire, how do you get out? People need to know the same thing. In case of a social, psychological, emotional trauma, how do we function? What's the next thing that we're supposed to do? That should be part of the lingua franca of being in the school.
Yeah, you know, a couple of things is absolutely. I know that well, for NASH, they just released the 3rd edition of the Prepare model, which in some ways kind of feels outdated now, but still nonetheless, there's active guidance and support coming out there. I know that Psca has also made all their resource library available, including crisis management tools. I feel like from a Pennsylvania standpoint, the Pennsylvania School Counselors Association, we've been fortunate enough to early on talk about the impact, the future impact of attendance for our students. We've actually been trying to develop some guides in association with Stacie. So we might want to connect because we don't want to replicate some materials that the state's already be putting out, but we can connect offline about that.
That sounds great.
You're sharing. Pardon me?
That sounds great.
Your people, my people.
I wanted to make one more recommendation on this, if I could, is the importance of coordinated community-based services. And again, some schools and communities are already doing that. But if schools aren't, this is a good time to start thinking about that. I know Pennsylvania has a huge communities and schools network. So that's an example. There's also, you know, models of children's advisory boards from the state on down onto districts. So I think that this idea of coordinated care and schools working with police and hospitals and mental health professionals and food banks and on and on and on. This is definitely the time to start thinking about how we're going to actually make good on our good intentions, because I know many schools have good intentions around that and it just doesn't happen. But how are we going to make good on those intentions moving into next year and create those systems and structures so that it's just part of the way we work going forward?
Exactly. And I think, you know, with our commitment to the MTSS system in the state, those school-wide teams, whether they be your PBIS teams or if you're fortunate enough to have a district-wide team, can be important players in that, but they are likely to be insufficient unless you already have very strong collaboration going on with your community-based services. Very good point, Whitney.
Yeah, what I really appreciate was the twofold process. I know, like, when we've, as a school closures first started, our first counseling staff meeting was to start anew our resource mapping process to make sure that we did understand and could do that outreach to coordinate care with our community providers as the continuing mental health services has clearly changed dramatically. And then separate to that, what we wanted to do was to make sure that we were also re-engaging with that as we look to come back to schools. That'll be a renewed conversation as well. And the one part that I heard you say, Whitney, that I didn't mention before was like really doing that internal mapping at the same time. That seems like something that'd be really valuable to do as well. Talking about those resources within the school that haven't been typically tapped into before to help with our overall school connectedness and wellness. I thought that was really something excellent to highlight as well. We've covered a lot of ground here. What are some other of those resources? You've both been so generous with your expertise and your insight and the resources array, but what are some of those other resources that we could highlight right now as far as building and maintaining school climate and culture?
Again, I wanted to just say for schools that already have a team, a coordinated team, whether it's, we call it the school climate leadership team. That's what we encourage people to create. But there might already be a team that does a similar function under a different name, and that's okay too. But here's the part that I do think is really important, is that that team have representation from every group in the school community. So there should be teacher representative, counselors, administrators, parents, students, and then I think that it's diverse and inclusive. And so that you've also got subgroups represented. And I think this is really important right now because one of the things that we have seen when schools that do the best job with family and parent engagement are the ones that work with individuals in each community to get to everybody, right? So it's like, use an example that's not going to work great right now, but for example, we do school climate surveys and we want to get response rates up from all the groups and from all the parents, that you could find a champion, a parent who goes to all the basketball games, and when they go to the basketball games they talk to the other parents that are at the basketball game. Are you tired of seeing these high suspension rates? Are you wanting to this, and that, and the other? I'll tell you what, you need to fill out the school climate survey. So people that will talk to other people in the community about the values that motivate them, and they're a trusted resource that will help the school. So this is a perfect, right now where this could be useful is in connecting families that we're struggling to get in touch with. Right? If you know, kind of doing the mapping, even the neighborhood mapping, do we see that there are a lot of families in certain neighborhoods? Is this a neighborhood where we're least likely to have the routine connection and engagement? Do we have one or two parents or other people that we can put on our leadership team that can help us stay connected to and engaged and get with that community? So I think, again, whatever you call the team or the group of people, the idea is to make sure that it is representative of all of the groups and in your school community. And the other point I would just put about that, because it'll help you solve real challenges. I mean, that's part of it. It's not just a feel-good thing. It's going to help you move the needle on the things that you really need to move the needle on. And then the other thing I would just say about that too is that goes to the idea, there's a lot of problems right now. We need everybody, and the solutions to problems are normally the closest to the people that are closest to them. So whether that's an expertise or whatever, but throwing all of those problems up on a board and then doing the mapping and making sure that you have a team of people that you can say, hey, can you get to this person? How many degrees of connection are, or this agency or whatever, is a really valuable thing to do right now.
And I would say the act of going through those processes where you're contributing to solving the problem can be very powerful. So I don't want us to forget that our students out there are also quite excellent assets, particularly as we're looking at secondary students. How can we engage them in meaningful ways, in reaching out to one another, into building a positive school climate and messaging around who we are and that we're going to get through this? How can we celebrate the successes and engage them in creative ways to lead those efforts? Because it's through those visual connections that they'll see to their peers where they'll know that things are moving in the right direction, because it'll start to feel a little more normal to them. Because for them, school is the relationship with their teacher, and it is the bell ringing every night, 40 minutes or whatever. But it is also those relationships with peers. So thinking about how we give our young people very visible and appropriate roles in helping us build a positive school climate during this time.
That's awesome. We covered a ton of ground.
Everybody
really
wants to be of service here.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has a role to play here. I think that's a valuable lesson to learn. What are some of the closing thoughts that you might have as we finish up? We covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate everything you shared so far.
Well, we'd originally talked about self-care. We were going to talk a little bit about that, and I think that's the thing that I want to touch on right now. I mean, I'm not working in a school, but I have a lot of friends and colleagues that are teachers, educators, and you know, there's a lot of stress there and having to learn how to do this job differently. I think the other thing is just the nature of the job has changed. Teachers are they have very relatively physical jobs. They're used to being up and moving and going from one space to another. Just the sheer transition of now I'm going to sit in front of a computer for 6 to 7 hours a day, you know, is it's huge. It's very difficult. And so I think self-care is really important right now. And one of the things that I would say about self-care is, again, the amount of time that you spend in front of the computer. I don't think anybody needs to be in front of a computer more than, I don't know, you know, for everybody different. But I'm going to say for me, I noticed that about 6 hours, and I don't mean 6 hours straight, I mean 6 total hours of reading emails and sharing, looking at a screen is about where my brain begins to mush out. And so I think lowering, you know, being realistic about the amount of time that people can be stationary and be looking at a computer screen is really important. And then also, as we've also, you know, making sure that in between, for me, I know, you know, I'm getting up a lot. I am scheduling virtual yoga and Pilates lessons with friends, and I'm not afraid, if I can, to schedule them, you know, at 1 p.m. on a Thursday, just because I know I need to get up and take a break. You know, I can't sit here all the time. So I think just, again, re-looking at the amount of time that we're asking ourselves to do something that our bodies and brains are not used to doing, and finding ways to break that up and maybe even shrink it and just be gentle and, you know, clear. Like, it's not the same. Getting up and moving and going to work every day to school is not the same as sitting at a computer all day long. And we need to accommodate that.
Yeah, I would reinforce that self-care is really critical, and just echo that parent self-care is going to be important for us to think about how we might take the lead in that regard too, because they are our teaching partners. And so thinking about that piece is a great opportunity area. There's a lot of positive messaging that can happen, and also supportive practices that we might be able to build and innovate right now for our families that could really pay dividends even. I mean, they'll meet the immediate need of ensuring that our families' mental health is better than it might be if we weren't encouraging self-care and being supportive to our parents. But I think in the long run, it will build stronger school communities. So that's important, self-care for everyone, and redefining the school to include families as co-educators.
Mm-hmm. And on the code, I just agree so much with all of that and the importance of the families. But I also want to say too, with that, is the last thing we want to do is reinforce feelings of inadequacy, you know, that parents are having as they try to support their students and their learning. And I know that, you know, we all want to keep students engaged and on task, but if we're doing that at the expense of their parents' well-being, if their parents are feeling that they can't adequately support them, then that is not good for our students. And we don't want young people or and you know, to develop a negative association with their academic pursuits because we're applying too much pressure now, nor do we want to further stress out and frustrate parents by putting them in a place where they don't feel adequate to support their children's needs. So I think that thinking about the total asks that we're making of parents and students every day from the school versus, you know, pocketing those, the teacher A, teacher B, teacher C, like what is this entire team of teachers asking of this group of parents is
I would say now more than ever, we might actually, it might be important for us to think about engaging parents as members of our teams so that we make sure that we're hearing from them or doing specific outreach. Those are all important points, Whitney.
Yeah.
Makes me think a lot of ATFB, like attachment-based family therapy. Maybe I will use the ways that we can best support our students is by supporting their parents sometimes. So yes. So we just talked a lot about self-care. So I know, Whitney, you had mentioned yoga and some other things, but what are you both doing for your own self-care?
I am gardening and doing a little running that I haven't made space in my life for recently. And I'd say I found some joy in cooking, which I have not in the past. I've not been a big meal planner, so I'm learning new skills.
Yeah, I'm like I said, I'm actually making a lot of space for exercising and moving and really enjoying that. I'm limiting the amount of time that I'm in front of this computer. I think it's really important. And I'm walking my dog occasionally. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been trying to do partner workouts with my son, so we've been having pull-up parties, which is mostly just us hanging around. Most importantly, I want to be really clear. I want to thank you both for just the volumes of knowledge that you shared. I know for me personally, I find it very meaningful. I'm sure that for our listeners too, they're going to be able to apply that directly to their students and their school communities for the betterment of it in such uncertain times. So I, again, want to really thank you. And then on behalf of PSEA, please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected. Thank you.
Thank you.